Mercer Holbrook stood at the window of his Colorado Springs home, absent-mindedly watching the snow fall. An old wound in his shoulder ached, heralding another sleepless night. 3 years had passed since that ill-fated tour of duty when a bullet from a juvenile drug addict had cut short his police career, but the pain still followed him like a faithful companion. Their house in an upscale neighborhood seemed a mockery of his current situation. Most of his savings had gone into the down payment, and now he and Daisy were paying a hefty mortgage. She had insisted on moving, claiming that the new environment would help him make a fresh start. But instead of a fresh start, Mercer felt increasingly alien in his own life. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the kitchen. Daisy always got home from school around 4, and the smell was part of their evening ritual. She loved to talk about her third graders, their successes, and funny incidents. Mercer nodded, trying to smile, but more often than not, he sank into his thoughts, returning to that fateful evening. He remembered every detail: the call to the troubled neighborhood, the dark hooded figure, the sudden flash of gunfire. Then there were the months of rehabilitation, the struggle with pain, and finally the forced retirement. 20 years of service ended in an instant. "Honey, dinner's ready," Daisy's voice snapped him out of his memories. She stood in the doorway, still in her navy-colored work dress. Her smile seemed a little strained lately, like she was tired of pretending everything was okay too. At dinner, Daisy talked about a new school project. St. James Private School was known for its innovative teaching methods, and her third-grade class was preparing something special for the spring festival. Mercer chewed mechanically, trying to concentrate on her words. But his thoughts drifted away again. "You're not listening to me at all." She sounded tired in her voice. "Why don't we go out on the town this weekend? It's been a while since we've been out." Mercer shook his head. "Sorry, honey. Shoulder's bothering me again. Maybe next time." He could see the disappointment in her eyes, but he couldn't bring himself to fake it. Evenings out on the town, restaurants, theaters. It all seemed so pointless after what he'd seen in his years of service. Real life was very different, cruel and merciless, and everything else was just a beautiful set. Daisy silently collected the dishes. Once they could talk for hours, made plans, dreamed of the future. Now their communication was reduced to the exchange of duty phrases and Daisy's attempts to shake up her husband. She still loved him, but every day she felt the wall growing between them. Later, lying in bed, Mercer listened to the steady breathing of his sleeping wife. The snow outside the window intensified, covering the city in a white blanket. Somewhere in the distance, a police siren wailed, and his heart clenched habitually. He knew he wouldn't sleep this night, as he had many nights before. The school bell cut through the morning silence, and the corridors of St. James's filled with children's voices. Daisy Holbrook stood at the door of her classroom, greeting her students with a smile. Every morning she found a special comfort in this ritual. Here, amidst the children's spontaneity and lively interest in life, she could forget about the heavy atmosphere at home. The classroom was decorated with brightly colored drawings and crafts of the students. The sunlight coming through the large windows created a warm, cozy atmosphere. Daisy loved her classroom. It was her personal space, where she felt needed and important. "Mrs. Holbrook, look what I drew!" Little Sophia held out a drawing of her family to her. Daisy felt her heart squeeze. There had been a child's drawing hanging in her own kitchen for a month that Mercer hadn't even noticed. The day flew by in a whirl of classes, recesses, and extracurricular activities. After school, Daisy stayed late, preparing for tomorrow. She deliberately delayed returning home, where the usual silence and her husband's distant gaze awaited her. When she finally arrived, Mercer was sitting in his chair, staring at the television, where another crime series was on. He didn't even turn his head when she entered. On the coffee table lay an open folder of his old files. He reread them over and over, as if trying to find something he'd missed. "I made lasagna." Daisy tried to lighten the atmosphere. "Your favorite." "Not hungry," he replied without taking his eyes off the screen. In the kitchen, Daisy mechanically laid out the dishes, remembering how they used to love to cook together. Mercer had been a great cook. His steaks were legendary at the police station. Now he rarely entered the kitchen, eating mostly sandwiches and convenience foods. In the evening, she checked her students' notebooks while sitting at the desk in their home office. The muffled sounds of the television came from the living room. Mercer was watching the news. She knew he was waiting for a crime story, after which he would take a long walk around the house, checking the locks on the doors and windows. With a red pen, Daisy was correcting mistakes on her children's work when she heard her husband on the phone. It was Jim, his former partner, the only one Mercer had kept in touch with since his retirement. They were discussing some old case, and her husband's voice sounded more animated than when he was talking to her. The next morning, Daisy awoke earlier than usual. Mercer was not in bed. He seemed to have spent the night in his chair again. She found him in the kitchen. He was sitting with a cup of cold coffee, staring out of the window with an unseeing gaze. There was a newspaper on the table, unfolded on the crime page. "Why don't we go out tonight?" she asked, even though she knew the answer in advance. "Sorry, I've arranged to meet Jim. Got some thoughts on the old Parker case." Daisy silently packed her bag and left for work. A new day at school awaited her, full of children's laughter and little discoveries. She loved her work all the more, finding in it a refuge from domestic problems. At a big break, Sarah, the teacher of a neighboring class, approached her. "Daisy, we're going to the Bluebird on Friday. Will you join us?" In the past, she had always turned down such offers in her hurry to get home to her husband. But now, after a second's hesitation, she nodded. "Yes, I'd love to." That evening, she told Mercer of her plans. He shrugged, not even looking at her. "Sure, go ahead. I was going to go over some case files anyway." Daisy stood at the window of her classroom, looking out at the falling snow. She thought about how imperceptibly their lives had split into two parallel worlds. Hers, filled with children's voices and school worries, and his, frozen in the past, where each day was an attempt to regain what was lost. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. It was the mother of one of the students who had come to discuss her son's progress. Daisy smiled welcomingly, putting aside her sad thoughts. At least here at school, she could still be herself. The parent-teacher conference was scheduled for Thursday evening. Daisy had prepared the classroom meticulously, hanging up the students' best work and compiling a detailed report on each child's progress. She loved these meetings. Being able to talk to parents about their children's achievements was always particularly satisfying. Parents began to gather by 6 o'clock. Daisy knew almost everyone. The prestigious St. James private school rarely changed its student body, so she noticed the new face at once. A tall man in an impeccable gray suit entered the classroom last, holding the hand of a little girl with red pigtails. "Good evening, I'm Griff Ashton, Lily's father." His handshake was confident and warm. "We recently moved to Colorado Springs." Daisy remembered Lily, the quiet, thoughtful girl who had appeared in class 2 weeks ago. She was excellent at drawing and had already made friends with several classmates. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Ashton. Lily is adapting well to her new group." Daisy pointed to an empty seat in the front row. The assembly began. Daisy talked about upcoming projects, class successes, and plans for the quarter. She could feel Griff Ashton's gaze on her, and for some reason it made her nervous. He asked intelligent questions, took a keen interest in the curriculum. After the formal part, parents took turns coming up to discuss their children's progress. Griff Ashton waited until everyone had dispersed. Lily was sitting at her desk, sketching passionately in her notebook. "Sorry to keep you." He placed a file folder on the teacher's desk. "These are Lily's characterizations from her previous school. We moved from Seattle after the divorce, and I wanted to make sure she was getting all the support she needed." Daisy was touched by his concern. Most single fathers reassign their children's education to nannies or new wives. Griff felt genuinely involved in his daughter's life. "You know, Lily is very talented." Daisy pulled a drawing of the girl from a folder. "We have a school exhibition in a month, and I think her work could—" "Daddy, look!" Lily ran up to them, holding out a new drawing. It depicted a teacher surrounded by flowers. "It's beautiful, Sunshine." Griff crouched down next to his daughter. "Mrs. Holbrook looks a lot like it." Daisy looked embarrassed. She was indeed recognizable in the drawing. right down to her favorite blue dress and hairstyle. "You have amazing patience with children," Griff remarked as Lily returned to her desk. "I watched you lead the assembly. It's rare to find such genuine passion for what you do." "It's mutual," Daisy smiled. "Children sense falsity. You can't fake it with them." They talked for almost another hour. Griff told her he was working as a realtor, opening an office in Colorado Springs. The divorce had been hard, but for Lily's sake, he and his ex-wife had maintained a normal relationship. Daisy caught herself thinking that she hadn't met such an attentive conversationalist in a long time. "It's getting late," she faltered, glancing at her watch. "My husband will be worried." "Sure, sorry for the delay," Griff helped Lily pack. "You know, my daughter and I have a tradition of going to the Mountain Creek Cafe near the school on Thursdays. Why don't you join us sometime? We can discuss Lily's progress in an informal setting." Daisy hesitated. It was a common suggestion from a student's parent, but something in Griff's eyes made her heart beat faster. "I'll think about it," she replied as she walked them to the door. Walking back home, Daisy caught herself smiling. The evening had been unexpectedly pleasant. She imagined telling Mercer about the new student and his caring father, but then she remembered that her husband hadn't been listening to much of her school stories lately. Mercer really hadn't noticed her late return. He was sitting at his computer, studying some old police reports, just mumbled something in response to her "I'm home," and continued to stare at the screen. At night, lying awake, Daisy thought about how easy it had been to talk to Griff Ashton. How long it had been since she had felt so alive. The thought startled her, and she forced herself to turn her attention to planning tomorrow's lessons. But the image of a tall man in a gray suit, with kind eyes and an attentive gaze, somehow wouldn't leave her mind. Daisy convinced herself it was just professional interest. Finally, a father truly involved in his child's education. But somewhere deep inside, she realized she was lying to herself. And in the next room, Mercer continued to study old cases, sinking deeper and deeper into the past, not noticing how the present was slowly slipping through his fingers. It had become a tradition to go to the Mountain Brook Cafe on Thursdays. At first, Daisy had refused, but Lily had asked her favorite teacher to join them so touchingly that it had been impossible to resist. Besides, Mercer was now meeting with his former colleagues every Thursday to discuss some complicated unsolved case, so he didn't even notice her absence. March was surprisingly warm. The Mountain Creek had a cozy veranda where Griff always reserved a table in the far corner of the room. Lily usually ate her favorite strawberry cheesecake quickly and ran off to the exotic fish tank, leaving the adults alone. "You look tired," Griff remarked one day as Daisy absent-mindedly stirred her cooled latte. "It's been a rough week. Mercer, he's completely distant. Yesterday I found him sleeping in a chair in front of the TV, watching tapes of old interrogations again." Griff gently covered her hand with his. "You deserve better than that." The touch seemed to awaken something long dormant in Daisy's soul. She jerked her hand away sharply, but all evening she felt his warmth. At home, she mechanically performed the usual activities, checking her notebooks, preparing dinner, folding the laundry. Mercer, as usual, sat in his office, piled with folders. He'd been on the phone with Jim a lot lately, discussing some evidence. Daisy heard snippets of conversation. Trace evidence at the crime scene, ballistics, new data. On weekends, she began to get out into the city more often. PTA, Teachers' Council, preparing for the school festival. Excuses were easy to find. Griff showed her a different Colorado Springs, cozy bookstores, small galleries, hidden parks. Sometimes Lily joined them, but more often the girl stayed with Nanny. Their first kiss happened in the botanical gardens. They walked among the blooming magnolias, discussing the upcoming school exhibition. Griff talked about his plans to buy Lily a set of professional paints, and Daisy explained how talented his daughter was growing up. At one point their gazes met, and the next thing Daisy remembered was the taste of his lips and the dizzying sensation of falling. That evening she stood under the shower for a long time, trying to wash away the guilt. But it was Griff's face, his attentive gaze, his warm smile, that came back again and again. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so alive. Mercer had begun to suspect something in late April. One day he asked why she was coming home from school so late. Daisy told him about the PTA, about preparing for the spring festival. He nodded, but there was something flickering in his gaze. Professional, the way he must have once looked at suspects. Their meetings with Griff had become more discreet. Now they saw each other in a small cafe on the outskirts of town, or walked in the park near the school. Griff rented an apartment near the center, for business meetings, he explained. There they could just be together, forgetting everything. Daisy noticed how her closet was changing. There were brighter colors, dresses that used to seem too daring. She began to go to the beauty salon more often, bought a new perfume. Mercer did not notice these changes, immersed in his investigations. One evening, she found a picture of herself from a parent-teacher conference on the kitchen table. In it, she and Griff stood a little closer than a teacher and parent of a student should. Daisy's heart sank, but Mercer didn't say anything, just looked at his wife carefully and left for his office. After this incident, he began to call her at school more often, sometimes even dropping by after school. Just for fun, to be around. Daisy felt the ring of suspicion shrinking, but she wouldn't, refuse to see Griff. In early May, Lily won the school exhibition. Her drawing, a portrait of her father and her favorite teacher surrounded by spring flowers, had won first place. Daisy went cold when she saw the work, but no one seemed to notice any special significance in the way the girl portrayed the two. Mercer did not come to the exhibition, though he had promised. Urgent business with Jim, was all he said. Daisy felt both relieved and bitter at the same time. She often couldn't sleep at night. She lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about how messed up everything was. Mercer was sleeping quietly next to her. He'd been taking sleeping pills lately. On the nightstand was another folder with a case he was trying to solve, and Daisy's phone was glowing with an unread message from Griff. "Miss you same time tomorrow?" A foreboding sense of trouble hung in the air. Daisy knew their secret couldn't stay secret forever. She saw her husband's professional gaze dwell on her more and more often, the way he checked her phone when he thought she was asleep. But every time she decided to end those meetings, it only took one smile from Griff, one touch from him, to make all good intentions crumble to dust. In her heart, she knew the denouement was close at hand. Mercer was too good a detective to remain in the dark much longer. But for now, she hid her fear under the mask of daily chores, checking notebooks, cooking dinner, planning lessons, and counting the hours until her next meeting with Griff. Griff Ashton's body was discovered by Mrs. Chen's housekeeper early Friday morning. She had a 3-year routine of coming in at 7 in the morning to prepare breakfast for Lily, who was due back from her mother's on the weekend. This time, something was wrong from the start. The usually neatly mowed lawn was strewn with fallen leaves that no one had cleaned up, and the front door was unlocked. For someone as pedantic about security as Griff, this was completely out of character. The morning air was fresh and clear. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A lawnmower was working in the neighboring yard. Mrs. Chen paused on the doorstep, listening to the silence of the house. Usually by this time, the noise of the coffee machine could already be heard. Griff always woke up early and worked in the home office before breakfast. Anxiety grew with every step. The living room was in perfect order, but there was a slight odor of alcohol in the air. Another oddity, for Griff hardly ever drank, only an occasional glass of whiskey in the evening. The study door was ajar. Mrs. Chen knocked, but there was no answer. She peered cautiously inside and cried out. Griff lay in a chair by the desk, his head unnaturally tilted back. A dark stain blurred on the light-colored carpet. Nearby on the desk were 2 glasses of leftover whiskey and an unfinished bottle of Macallan, the landlord's favorite. Detectives Reed Callahan and Sage Donovan arrived 20 minutes after the 911 call. Callahan, a massive man in his 50s with a hard stare and graying temples, went straight to the body. Donovan, a slender woman with a short haircut and a tenacious gaze, busied herself with questioning the housekeeper, who was still in a state of shock. "What time do you usually come in?" Donovan's voice was soft, soothing. 7 o'clock in the morning, always 7 o'clock. Mrs. Chen rubbed the edge of her apron nervously. Mr. Ashton really appreciated punctuality. I cook breakfast, clean the house, do the laundry, especially when Lily arrives. God, the poor girl. Time of death is between 10 and midnight. The CSI finished his initial examination. 2 gunshots. The nature of the wounds suggests a professional shooter. The office was in perfect order, disturbed only by an overturned bottle of water on the desk. It lay on its side, forming a small puddle on the polished mahogany surface. There was a broken photo frame lying nearby, a picture of Lily from the last school holiday. The picture showed the girl smiling, holding a drawing of some kind. No sign of forced entry, Donovan observed, scrutinizing the door locks. The victim knew his killer, probably let him into the house herself. By noon, the Ashton mansion had become a veritable anthill. Forensic scientists were methodically collecting evidence. Photographers were capturing every detail. Forensic experts were dusting every surface for prints. In the air hung the pungent smell of special powders mixed with the heavy aroma of spilled whiskey. Neighbors, attracted by the unusual cluster of police cars, gathered behind the yellow tape. Through the open windows came scraps of conversation. Such a decent man, always saying hello, and his daughter is so cute. Check his contacts, calls, work connections, Callahan ordered, looking at the gathered crowd, especially in the last week, and canvass all the neighbors. In a neighborhood like this, people tend to notice any oddities. Donovan nodded, making notes in her notebook. She noticed that there was an empty glass on the windowsill and crumpled papers in the trash can. By evening, the body had been taken to the morgue. The house gradually emptied, with only the yellow police tape fluttering in the wind. The setting sun tinted the windows of the study where the tragedy had played out a few hours ago, an ominous red. "Something's not right here," Donovan said, getting into the car. "It all looks too neat. It's like someone wanted us to see this particular painting." Callahan looked at the house thoughtfully. "Tomorrow, we'll start by checking his work contacts. The real estate business isn't an easy field." The car moved off the lot. The luxurious mansion that held the secret of Griff Ashton's last minutes of life was slowly disappearing in the rearview mirror. The morning at the Colorado Springs police station had started earlier than usual. Detective Donovan sat at her desk, poring over notes from yesterday's statement. The coffee in the paper cup had long since gone cold, but she didn't even notice it, fully immersed in her work. "Our victim had an appointment at St. James School that afternoon." She looked up at Callahan, who had entered. "A parent-teacher meeting for the 3rd grade class his daughter attends." Callahan sank into a creaky chair, spreading the crime scene photos on the table. What else do we know about his routine? After lunch, meeting with clients at a real estate agency, then, according to the phone calendar entries, lunch at Mountain Creek. Last call logged in at 19:30, talking to his ex-wife about his daughter's impending arrival. A young officer peeked into the office. "Detectives, the ballistics results are in." The shots were fired at close range. The .38 caliber special is a common police weapon. Callahan frowned, making notes in his notebook. "Interesting that no personal weapons were found in the house," Donovan observed. Although neighbors claim Ashton kept a gun for self-defense, he did have a gun permit. By 10 o'clock, the first important witness appeared at the station, the principal of St. James School, Mrs. Porter. The tall woman in a strict suit held herself with dignity, but it was noticeable that the news of Ashton's death had shaken her. "Mr. Ashton was very involved in his daughter's school life," she recounted. "Always present at assemblies, involved in organizing activities. Lily is a talented girl, especially in drawing." "How was his relationship with his teachers?" Donovan watched the principal's response carefully. "Fine, especially with the classroom teacher, Mrs. Holbrook. Mrs. Porter stammered. "Perhaps I shouldn't talk about it. Any information could be important." Callahan nudged her gently. "There's been some talk lately about... You see, it's a small school. Everybody knows each other. Mrs. Holbrook and Mr. Ashton often met after school. Discussed Lily's progress, of course." After the headmaster left, the detectives glanced around. "Check on this Mrs. Holbrook." Callahan rose from the table. "And I'll go to the real estate agency." By lunchtime, Daisy Holbrook's personnel file was on Donovan's desk. Married, 38 years old, worked at St. James for 7 years. Impeccable reputation, loved by students, respected by co-workers. "Husband's an ex-cop," she murmured, reading the details. "Left the force 3 years ago after being wounded." There was a knock on the door. Callahan had returned, and it was clear from his face that he hadn't learned anything important. "The agency is clear." Callahan sank tiredly into a chair. Successful realtor, good reputation, satisfied clients. But his secretary hinted that he's been leaving early a lot lately and canceling appointments. Atypical behavior for a man who's always been obsessed with punctuality. But Donovan's phone rang. The experts had finished analyzing the contents of the victim's computer. "Found deleted correspondence." The technician's voice sounded agitated. "Looks like a romantic relationship. There's no name of the person, but from the content, it's someone from school. Call Mrs. Holbrook in for questioning," Callahan ordered. "Just be careful, don't want to spook her." Daisy Holbrook appeared at the station toward evening. In a severe dark blue dress, she looked collected but pale. Sat down across from Donovan, folding her hands in her lap. "I'm so sorry about Mr. Ashton." Her voice trembled slightly. "It's a terrible tragedy for the whole school. It's going to be hard on Lily." "Tell us about your relationship with Mr. Ashton," Donovan began softly. "The usual teacher-parent relationship. He cared very much for his daughter's education." "And the meetings at the Mountain Creek Cafe? Was that part of the educational process too?" Daisy turned even paler, her fingers nervously clutching her purse. We... At that moment, an officer peered into the interview room. "Detective Donovan, you have an urgent call." Behind the glass, Callahan watched Daisy's reaction. Something about her demeanor seemed odd to him. Not just the nervousness of someone who'd lost a loved one, but some underlying fear. "Tech found something else," Donovan returned a few minutes later. "There was a secret messaging app on Ashton's phone. The correspondence has been deleted, but we're working on recovering it." The day was winding down toward evening. Daisy Holbrook had been released home but had been placed under unspoken surveillance. The detectives were piecing together a mosaic of facts, not yet adding up to a coherent picture. "You know what worries me?" Donovan tapped her pencil thoughtfully on the table. "Those 2 glasses of whiskey. The killer drank with the victim before he shot him. It's personal." "We'll check on the husband tomorrow morning." Callahan rubbed his eyes tiredly. An ex-cop with access to a gun is serious talk. Only a desk lamp burned in the deserted precinct. The evidence board was filled with new photos, notes, connections. Somewhere among these details lurked a clue, but it had yet to be reached. A fine rain drizzled at dawn. Daisy woke to the sound of the alarm clock and reached across to the other half of the bed, empty and cold. She couldn't remember what time Mercer had left last night. I think he'd mumbled something about meeting Jim. It was a common occurrence. He'd often been back past midnight or in the morning lately. The kitchen greeted her with an unaccustomed silence. Usually, no matter how late Mercer returned, there was always an empty coffee cup on the table. He couldn't do without his morning ritual. But today, the kitchen looked untouched. Dishes washed from the evening, towels neatly folded, coffee machine polished. Mercer's cell phone didn't answer. Daisy dialed the number a 3rd time, listening to the long beeps. She felt increasingly uneasy. After yesterday's conversation with the detectives, she felt like she was in a vacuum. Every sound, every movement echoed inside. At 8 in the morning, the doorbell rang. Detectives Callahan and Donovan stood on the doorstep, drenched in the spring rain. "Mrs. Holbrook, we need to speak to your husband." Callahan tried to speak softly, but there was a professional note in his voice. "He's not home." Daisy ushered the detectives into the hallway. "Went out to a friend's house last night and didn't come back. I thought maybe he slept over at his place." "What friend?" Donovan pulled out a notepad. "Jim Riley. They used to work together on the police force. They see each other a lot, talk about old cases." The living room looked spotlessly clean. Daisy had been saving herself from anxiety by cleaning for the last few days. Only the coffee table bore traces of Mercer's presence, an unread newspaper, an empty coffee mug, a tattered detective novel. "What time did he leave?" Callahan surveyed the room with a keen eye. "Around 8 in the evening. I was checking notebooks in the study, and he stopped by to say goodbye. Said Jim had some new information on some old case." Donovan was writing something down, and Daisy couldn't escape the feeling of unreality of what was happening. Just 2 days ago, her life had been different, with secrets, with guilt, but understandable. Now it was falling apart like a house of cards. "May I see your husband's office?" Callahan asked. Mercer's office was located at the end of the hallway. It was a creative mess, with pictures and newspaper clippings lining the walls, file folders piled on the desk, and notes scattered everywhere in his sloppy handwriting. "He spends a lot of time here." Daisy stopped in the doorway. "Since leaving the service, this has become his sanctuary." The detective scrutinized the office. Donovan noticed the calendar. Yesterday's date was circled in red marker. An open day planner lay on the desk, the last entry cut off halfway through. Callahan's phone rang, breaking the silence. He stepped out into the hallway, but Daisy heard a scrap of conversation. "A car? Where exactly? Secure the area. We're moving out." "Mrs. Holbrook," Callahan returned to the office. "Your husband has a gray Toyota Camry, correct?" Daisy nodded, feeling the ground go from under her feet. "It was just found near the Arkansas River, not far from the lookout. The car's empty, but..." He paused. Traces of blood were found on the seat. Donovan supported the staggered Daisy. One thought pulsed in her head. "What have you done, Mercer?" The rain intensified, drumming on the roof of the house. The study became dark, as if the very walls were shrinking around them. Somewhere in the back of the house, a clock ticked, counting down the hours in a new reality where nothing would ever be the same again. "We need to go to the scene." Callahan said something else about protocol, about the need to formally identify the car, but Daisy barely heard him. She stared at the picture on the office wall, she and Mercer on the day he graduated from the police academy, young, happy, full of hope. When had it all had time to go wrong? The detectives were talking about something, calling for backup, coordinating with the group by the river. The sounds came through absorbent cotton. Daisy mechanically answered questions, gathered the necessary documents, but panic was growing inside. As she left the house, she froze on the porch. Neighbors had already begun to gather, attracted by the police cars. Mrs. Parker, from the next street over, was loudly discussing something with the mailman. News travels fast in a small town. The rain turned into a downpour as they approached the river. Police cars with their blinkers on lit up the gray Toyota standing alone at the edge of the cliff. Forensic officers in hazmat suits bustled around, stretching yellow tape. The river below bubbled, swollen from the rains. Rescuers in boats surveyed the shoreline. Daisy watched the commotion as if in slow motion, trying to comprehend what was happening. "Signs of a struggle in the passenger compartment," the CSI reported. "Blood on the driver's seat and dashboard, wallet and ID in place, keys in the ignition." In the back seat of the car lay Mercer's old leather jacket, the same one he wore to important meetings with Jim. The pocket revealed a crumpled photograph, their wedding picture 12 years ago. The afternoon slowly flowed into evening. Daisy sat in the police car, wrapped in a blanket that someone had carefully thrown over her shoulders. The detectives were interviewing witnesses, an elderly couple walking their dog who had noticed suspicious activity by the river last night. "We'll find him." Donovan crouched next to her, holding out a cup of hot coffee. There was a strange uncertainty in her voice, as if she didn't believe her own words. The third 24 hours of the search for Mercer Holbrook were fruitless. Detective Donovan's office was cluttered with files from two cases, the murder of Griff Ashton and the disappearance of a former policeman. On the wall hung a whiteboard with photos, dates, and notes connected by red threads. The morning briefing had ended an hour ago. Divers surveyed another stretch of the river, search teams combed the shore, but no trace was found. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a chilly dampness and fog. Something doesn't add up. Donovan looked over the forensics reports for the 100th time. Her desk was cluttered with papers, 3 empty coffee cups testifying to a sleepless night. Callahan entered the office, shaking drops off his raincoat. Neighbors saw a gray Toyota outside Ashton's house the night of the murder. Can't identify the exact model, but the description is similar. Too obvious. Donovan shook her head. If Mercer really did kill Ashton out of jealousy, why leave so many traces? I mean, he's an ex-cop, knows all the procedures. She stood up, walked over to the board. 2 pictures, a smiling Griff Ashton and a serious Mercer Holbrook in a police uniform, stared at her as if trying to say something. Check Holbrook's calls again over the last week. Callahan poured himself some coffee from the old coffee maker in the corner. Especially the conversations with that friend of his, Jim Riley. Donovan opened a folder of phone call printouts. Something about the last conversation she'd had with Daisy Holbrook kept her on edge. The woman was scared, but not in the way wives of missing husbands usually were. "Wait a minute," she straightened. "Have we checked the calls from the Holbrooks' home phone?" "I don't think so." Callahan stepped up to the board. "Think there's something there?" An hour later, they had a printout of all the calls. Donovan ran her finger along the lines until she stopped. "Here, the day before Ashton was killed, an incoming call from a payphone at the bus station. The conversation lasted 23 minutes. Who uses payphones now?" Callahan frowned. "Check the cameras at the station." The security footage appeared blurry, but one detail caught his eye. The man at the payphone was wearing the uniform of a parking lot security guard. "Wait a minute." Donovan flipped through the paperwork quickly. "Jim Riley has been working as head of security at the bus station since his retirement from the police force." She grabbed her phone, dialed a number. "I need information on James Riley. All movements in the last week." While they waited for the information, the detectives went over the case files one more time. Ballistics testing showed that the bullets that killed Ashton were fired from a police service weapon decommissioned 3 years ago. "That's the answer," Donovan said quietly. Jim Riley. He was helping Mercer. At that moment, a young officer ran into the office. "Detectives, Mercer Holbrook was just seen at a service station in the suburbs." Callahan was already putting on his jacket. "Assault team in place, and find me Riley." Donovan looked at the board where red threads linked the photos and notes. Now the picture was coming together. Mercer had found out about his wife's affair, tracked down Ashton, and his old friend Jim had helped cover his tracks and fake his disappearance. The car sped down the wet highway. Donovan looked at the trees whizzing by and thought about how one chance encounter at school had led to such a tragedy. "You know what the worst part is?" she said. "He planned the whole thing. Used his police knowledge, his connections, his experience. But what gave him away in the end was a simple human habit of calling home, of hearing his wife's voice, even as he prepared to punish her." Callahan nodded silently, gazing down the road. Ahead showed the lights of the service station where this story was to end. Police cars were already assembling in the parking lot, an extraction team taking up positions. Somewhere out there, in a small roadside diner, sat a man who thought he could cheat the system he had once served. The rain began to sprinkle again, as if nature was preparing to witness the final scene of this drama. The Pine Forest Motel on the outskirts of Cheyenne, Wyoming, had seen better days. The peeling paint on the walls, the rusted numbers on the doors, the broken asphalt of the parking lot, all told that the glory days of this place were in the past. The perfect hideaway for someone looking to disappear. The receptionist, an older woman with carrot-colored dyed hair, didn't even glance at the driver's license of the guest in room 12. Cash up front, no questions asked. She'd seen enough of these people in her 30 years on the job. The tired look, the wrinkled clothes, the unremarkable car in the parking lot. Detectives Callahan and Donovan parked 3 blocks from the motel. The SWAT team had already taken up positions, 4 unremarkable vans with tinted windows spread out around the perimeter. A fine rain drizzled in the morning twilight, turning the dust of the parking lot into a muddy mess. "He's been in there for 4 days. Donovan reviewed the latest surveillance data. "Only goes out to the convenience store on the next block. Always in the dark, always different routes." Callahan checked his weapon. Old police habits. Knows how to evade surveillance. The phone vibrated in his pocket. A call from Colorado Springs. Jim Riley finally spoke. After 12 hours of interrogation, he admitted that he'd helped a friend stage the disappearance, but swore he didn't know about Ashton's murder. "Mercer called me that night," Riley recounted. "Said he couldn't take the humiliation anymore, that he had to disappear. I helped him with the paperwork, gave him the address of a safe house. Thought he just needed time to think things over." Donovan took one last sip of her cooled coffee. She'd drunk so much of it these days that the caffeine was no longer working. The pieces of the puzzle swirled in her head. The 2 glasses of whiskey at Ashton's house, the missing police gun, old scores and new grudges. At 6 o'clock in the morning, it began to lighten. A man in a worn denim jacket came out of room 12. He stopped, lit a cigarette, looked around the empty parking lot. His movements were slow, tired, not at all like the trim officer in the photo from 3 years ago. "It's time," Callahan signaled to the extraction team. It happened quickly and quietly. Mercer didn't resist, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. When the handcuffs clicked, he only breathed a sigh of relief. The room looked like a temporary residence. A crumpled bed, empty whiskey bottles on the table, a laptop open. On the screen was a news page with a headline about the murder of a realtor in Colorado Springs. "You're faster than I thought," were Mercer's first words. His voice was hoarse, tired. The room smelled of stale tobacco smoke and cheap motel air freshener. On the nightstand by the bed was a picture of Daisy, an old one from her wedding. Next to it is a service pistol, the same one that fired the fatal shots. "Have a seat, Mr. Holbrook." Donovan pointed to the only chair by the window. "Tell us everything." Mercer sank into the chair, pulled out a cigarette with trembling hands. "You know, I've been following them for weeks, haven't I? Every Thursday, meetings at the cafe, every weekend, walks in the park. She laughed with him in a way she hadn't laughed with me in years." Outside the window, a new day was beginning. Somewhere in the distance, trucks hummed on the highway, and the TV was on in the next room. "I didn't plan to kill him." Mercer looked somewhere through the wall. "Just wanted to talk that night. Brought some whiskey. I thought we'd settle the matter man to man. But he started talking about his plans, about how he and Daisy were going to leave after the divorce." He fell silent, clutching an unlit cigarette in his fingers. "The first shot was almost accidental, and the second was already conscious. Professional habit. Check shot to the head." Donovan wrote down the statement, but couldn't escape the feeling of some understatement in his words. Too smooth, too logical for a crime of passion. "Why the stage disappearance?" Callahan asked. "Could have just left, gotten lost." Mercer grinned unfunny. 20 years on the force? I knew they'd find me sooner or later. Just wanted to buy time, make them believe a different version. Stupid, huh? There was a knock at the door. A second team had arrived with a search warrant. The usual protocol began: photographs, evidence collection, inventory. In Mercer's bag, they found $10,000 in cash, forged documents, and a map with a marked route to Canada. At the bottom was a tattered notebook scribbled in small handwriting, the diary he'd been keeping for the last few weeks. "I want to make an official statement," Mercer said as he was led out of the room. "A full confession. Daisy didn't know about anything. It's all my fault." The morning sun was flooding the motel parking lot. Regulars peered out from behind the curtains, watching as the handcuffed man was ushered into a police car. Donovan got behind the wheel. It was going to be a long drive back to Colorado Springs, where mountains of paperwork, witness interviews, and a trial awaited them. "You know what's weird?" she said, pulling onto the highway. He thought of everything: the murder, the escape, the false trails, but he left his wife's picture out in the open. It's like part of him wanted to be found. Callahan remained silent, looking in the rearview mirror at their passenger. Mercer Holbrook sat motionless, covering his eyes. He might have looked like he was asleep, but the slight tension in his shoulders betrayed his insomnia. Ahead lay an empty road leading back to the town where the story had begun, where, in a small private school, an elementary school teacher would be trying to explain to her students why their favorite classmate Lily was no longer coming to class. The rain has finally stopped, leaving behind humid air and a feeling of cleansing. Another case closed, another story came to an end. But the detectives knew, stories like this never completely end. They live on in people's memories, in newspaper archives, in court records, mute witnesses to how love can turn into obsession and pain into crime.